All right, let's jump right into this comprehensive study. Today, we are presenting a full summary analyzing some truly intense, incredibly high-stakes theological debates between Christian apologists and Muslim debaters, specifically focusing on the deeply contested issue of scriptural corruption, which is known as Tahrif. Now, this study is sourced directly from several prominent debate channels, including Godlogic Apologetics and a few others. And just so you know, a link is below in the description box, so you can go check out the raw original exchanges for yourself after we're done here. What we are doing today is unpacking exactly how these two opposing sides argue over whether Islamic theology inherently demands that previous scriptures were corrupted. And more importantly, we're looking at what that alleged corruption means for the absolute trustworthiness of the divine message. We're going to walk through these complex arguments step by step, completely impartially, just mapping out the claims and the rebuttals. The stakes in these debates are literally as high as they can get, because both sides firmly believe that the eternal destiny of humanity hinges entirely on accurately identifying which texts contain the pure, uncorrupted voice of the divine. So here is the roadmap for our study today. We'll kick things off by unpacking the scriptural dilemma, then move right into the Quranic affirmation of texts. After that, we'll break down a very famous argument known as the babysitter analogy, followed by the varied responses from Muslim debaters. Then we'll explore abrogation and divine wisdom, and finally we'll wrap the whole thing up with a summary of this massive impasse. Starting with Section 1, the scriptural dilemma. To truly grasp the gravity of the arguments we're about to dive into, we absolutely have to establish the shared baseline. Before they disagree, both sides of the aisle actually wholeheartedly agree that these four specific historical scriptures are foundational. In Islamic theology, it's universally acknowledged that God gave the Torah to Moses, the Psalms or the Zabur to David, the Gospel, the Injil to Jesus, and ultimately the Quran to Muhammad. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand. These figures aren't viewed as competing founders of rival religions, not at all. They are revered as prophets within one single continuous lineage of divine revelation. So the fierce, often unyielding debate you see between these Christian apologists and Muslim debaters isn't about whether these books were originally given by God. They agree on that. The central question, the real battlefield here, is about their historical preservation. What exactly happened to those ancient texts over centuries of human history? Are the words people read today the exact words that were originally spoken? That is where the paths completely diverge. And that brings us to the core tension driving our entire study today, which really boils down to competing concepts of divine protection. Let's look at the apologist view first. Christian apologists challenge the idea that a religion claiming its own previously revealed scriptures were corrupted can actually be trustworthy. Their argument leans heavily on the unchanging nature of a perfect deity. Basically, they assert that a divine being who fails to protect his first three major revelations just cannot logically be trusted to protect the fourth one. If God's word can be broken, altered, or erased by human interference, they argue, well then his overarching power is highly questionable. But, on the flip side, the Muslim debaters maintain a fundamentally different paradigm. They argue that only the final revelation, the Quran, required perfect, eternal preservation. In their theological framework, those prior revelations were deliberately meant only for specific historical times and very specific regional populations. Because those earlier texts essentially had a built-in expiration date, human corruption was a tragic reality of human history, for sure, but it absolutely was not a failure of divine power. Let's move into Section 2, Quranic affirmation of texts. Now, what's really fascinating about this part of the debate is how apologists use the Quran itself to challenge the Muslim position. They don't just use external historical documents. They go straight to the text. They point to verses like Surah 3, verses 3 through 4, to argue that the Quran explicitly affirms the inspiration and the ongoing authority of the Torah and the Gospel. Apologists put a massive emphasis on that word right there, confirming. They argue that back in the 7th century, when these very words were being spoken, the Quran was actively confirming the validity of texts that were physically in the possession of the Jewish and Christian communities at that exact moment in time. The apologist's logic is pretty straightforward here. You simply cannot confirm something that no longer exists or has already been fundamentally, hopelessly altered. Furthermore, apologists like David Wood ask a very targeted, highly specific historical question using Surah 547, which says, "Let the people of the gospel judge by what God hath revealed therein." Wood and other prominent debaters in these circles argue that the timeline here is deeply, deeply problematic for the Islamic narrative of corruption. They ask this: why in the world would the Quran command Christians to actively judge their lives by the gospel in the 7th century if that gospel had already been hopelessly corrupted centuries earlier by church councils or scribes? They argue that this verse heavily implies the text must have been reliable and intact during the time of Muhammad, because if it wasn't, they argue, then God would essentially be instructing believers to govern themselves using a corrupted, fraudulent book. And that exact line of questioning poses a absolutely devastating logical dilemma for the Muslim debaters in the source material we analyzed. It sets up what apologists consider to be a foolproof theological trap. Think about it in a live debate setting. This forces the opposing side to navigate an incredibly narrow path. If the prior texts were corrupted, why on earth point people back to them for supreme moral guidance and legal judgment? The apologist in our study insists that you really only have two options. Either the previous scriptures remain entirely uncorrupted, or the Quran is purposefully commanding believers to follow corrupted texts. Both of those options present massive, almost insurmountable theological hurdles for the Muslim debater to overcome, which is exactly why this is one of the most frequently deployed, heavy-hitting arguments you'll see in these public exchanges. All right, let's transition to Section 3, the babysitter analogy. To really drive this whole point home, apologists heavily utilize a specific rhetorical device. It's designed to rigorously test the logic of trusting a God who allows his own scriptures to be lost. So I want you to imagine you're leaving for the weekend. You're hiring a babysitter, and this babysitter has a known track record of watching 4 children. Throughout the course of her employment, she tragically loses the first child, which, in this analogy, represents the Torah. Then she loses the second child, representing the Psalms. Not long after that, she lets the third child wander completely off a cliff, representing the gospel. But miraculously, with the fourth child, the Quran, she protects it perfectly. The apologists turn directly to their debate opponents and ask a very simple, jarring question. Would you hire that babysitter for your own kids? This analogy is purposefully designed to force debate opponents into an incredibly uncomfortable corner. It really pushes them into either admitting God was essentially incompetent in protecting his most valuable assets, his divine words, or conceding that the prior scriptures were never actually lost or corrupted in the first place. By taking this super complex theological concept of textual preservation and translating it into a deeply relatable human scenario of trust and track records, apologists create a highly effective rhetorical tool. It immediately puts the opposing debater on the defensive regarding the fundamental trustworthiness of their entire theology. Which brings us nicely to Section 4, Responses from Muslim Debaters. Now, in the debates we analyzed, the Muslim speakers certainly do not shy away from this dilemma. They don't back down. Rather, they offer several distinct and frankly fascinating frameworks to explain why the corruption of earlier texts doesn't actually compromise the Islamic faith at all. One remarkable defense we see in the sources is the argument of deliberate corruption. One debater specifically posited that God actually permitted the corruption of the earlier texts in his infinite divine wisdom. The underlying logic here is actually quite striking. If the Torah and the Gospel had remained perfectly, flawlessly intact alongside the Quran, humanity might be terribly confused about which specific set of laws to follow. By purposefully allowing the older covenants to fade or be altered over time, God ensured that all future generations would be completely compelled to focus solely on the final, unified, and perfected message. Another really common alternative defense cited in these debates relies on the interpretations of the esteemed Islamic scholar al-Bukhari. This view suggests that the corruption, Tahrif, was actually a distortion of semantic meaning and interpretation, rather than a literal, physical alteration of the ancient manuscripts. Under this specific academic framework, the actual physical words of the Torah and Gospel remain exactly as they were revealed. The text itself is pure. However, human beings actively twisted those meanings with their tongues, purposefully misinterpreting the original divine intent to suit their own political or cultural desires. It's a really nuanced defense that argues the ink on the parchment is perfectly safe, but the human understanding of that ink became hopelessly corrupted over time. However, it's important to note that not all Muslim debaters agree with that misinterpretation-only theory. In fact, many completely reject it. They rely heavily on the severe warning found in Surah 279 to insist that literal physical tampering by human hands did indeed occur. They point out that chilling phrase, "Woe to those who write the book with their own hands," to argue that individuals literally forged false scriptures. They physically altered texts and falsely claimed they were divine. For these debaters, the sheer severity of this curse proves that the texts currently held by Jews and Christians are structurally and textually corrupted at a foundational physical level. And because of that, they are stripped of their authority, forcing true believers to rely entirely on the uncorrupted Quran. Let's dive into Section 5, Abrogation and Divine Wisdom. The principle of abrogation, known in Arabic as naskh, is absolutely central to the Muslim defense in almost every single debate covering this topic. It's a major theological concept that attempts to resolve the friction between old laws and new mandates. Muslim debaters argue that even if prior texts contain undeniable historical truths, their specific laws were officially abrogated, meaning they were updated or completely replaced by the Quran. They argue that God, in his infinite wisdom, provides different laws for different eras of human development. So, for example, specific dietary restrictions or the rigid laws of the Sabbath were legally binding for the ancient Israelites, but they were completely overwritten by the new revelation. In this view, God isn't changing his mind or admitting a mistake. He is simply progressing humanity through different, necessary stages of a grand theological curriculum. So the crucial point these debaters make is that abrogation does not mean the prior texts were initially false. It simply means their expiration date has passed. You can think of it much like an old legal contract. The Torah and the Gospel were sent for a specific demographic at a highly specific historical moment with a temporary mandate. They were localized treaties, essentially. But in stark contrast, the Quran was sent for all of humanity, spanning all of eternity with a permanent mandate. Therefore, the old books simply no longer require perfect historical preservation because their localized, temporary purpose has been entirely fulfilled by the arrival of the new universal book. Okay, let's wrap this up with Section 6, Summary of the Impasse. We have now presented a full summary of this study, highlighting two completely irreconcilable frameworks for understanding how the divine interacts with human history. Let's recap. On one side, Christian apologists maintain that a trustworthy God inherently demands universal scriptural protection right from the very beginning. For them, historical continuity is the ultimate proof of the divine, and they argue the Quran logically traps itself by affirming older texts it simultaneously claims are corrupted. But on the exact opposite side, Muslim debaters maintain that God deliberately permitted early corruption in his divine wisdom to prevent confusion and highlight the absolute finality of the Quran. They rely heavily on the doctrine of abrogation to establish a paradigm where older texts naturally expire, allowing the Quran to stand as the ultimate, updated authority that supersedes all prior laws. So this brings us to a final thought for you to ponder based on everything we've covered in this study. When examining the long, incredibly complex history of divine revelation, how do you personally weigh the criteria for scriptural preservation? Ultimately, does an updated final message gracefully resolve the issue of prior corrupted texts, or does a perfect God demand perfect preservation of his word right from the start? It's a profound question, and it's one that continues to drive these intense, fascinating debates today. Thanks so much for joining me for this full summary, and keep exploring the deep history behind these worldviews.